welcome to Gig Start's weekly podcast, where we bring together experts from the tech market to discuss the best practices on how to scale your startup. I'm Abraham, and today I'm joined by Michele, the Director of Engineering at Elements. How are you doing, Michele?
Hey, hi, Abraham. So well, actually, I'm glad to be here. How about you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's been a very, very busy week for us, but looking forward to the weekend. But no, thanks for coming on. And I guess to get started, I mean, for the audience, could you just start by telling us a bit about yourself, a bit about your experience at the moment?
Yeah, why not? Of course. So my background is essentially like back-end software engineering when I started, and I progressed into management, initially like team level, then departments. I work in large banks and tiny companies and anything in
Yeah.
between and across many industries. And now I'm basically doing technical direction roles. I've been a CTO before, and here I am.
Yeah. What do you prefer, would you say? The smaller organizations where, lots of moving
Mhm.
parts, lots of things to do, or the larger, more established ones where, the processes are already in place?
I guess somewhere in between, like companies where people care about, doing things properly and starting to structure those processes, but companies where they're not already there because otherwise they don't have much work to do.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the candidates we speak to, we tend to see career progression be the main reason for why they're looking at new opportunities.
Mhm.
So we've seen trends where people are leaving larger organizations to join earlier stage startups, build out the processes, leave their mark on the company. Um, Obviously, you briefly mentioned, but I know from your past experience, you've worked at sort of startups like Index Labs and R3. How would you say your experience at those sorts of organizations compared in terms of your day to day compared to maybe JP Morgan, for example, where
Mhm.
you also used to work?
Yeah, I guess what's really true is that you learn different things in different places. As an example, I cannot say that if you work in larger companies, you're gonna learn more as opposed to smaller companies, the other way around. It's just like you learn different things, right? So in startups, the amount of responsibility that you personally get, you will never get in an established company, right?
Yeah,
So as an
true.
example, if you join a Google, they are, I don't know, 80,000 engineers and everyone's been working like clockwork for 20 years. What you gonna do, right? And
Sure.
personally. And even if you work in a team that's solving some really interesting problems, like a lot of companies outside of Funk, they don't have the same problems or they're not as important there. While if you work like in startups, as I was saying, well, you're typically get to be responsible for something fairly important and you have to own it. And you can get in touch with founders, you can speak to customers directly. It's actually quite exciting. In large companies, well, you really need to understand scale and it's different working a team of five as opposed to a team of 500, and managing one is definitely a different beast. So that there's
Sure.
always like some complexities and plenty to learn on both sides.
Yeah, no, and then there's like corporate structures. Obviously, there's like more middle management in those companies, and you don't really get to see on the ground. And I guess that sort of leads me
Yeah.
to my next. Yeah, I mean, in terms of hiring as well, I mean, are there any challenges from the startups that you worked in, when you were building out the teams? And obviously, you said you took on different responsibilities. What sort of challenges did you face when it came to
Yeah, I
hiring?
guess like it's hard when you don't have the name out, and so in particular nobody knows you, and you need to be like, hey guys, the new company out there, and you need to risk a little bit, come and working with us. We don't have offices that are amazing and look incredible with free beer and
Sure.
whatnot. So it's nothing
Yeah.
like yeah, you tend to attract a different kind of person, and also like people need to wear many hats in a smaller companies. So like you can't really aim at attracting people that are super specialized and they only want to do that one thing, right? And so in general, you hire a lot of full stack people or a bit of a healthy mix in a team, but like you have to find people that are very dynamic and they're ready to like, risk a little bit as well. So typically you compensate them with equity, which is how the game works. But yeah, I would say those are the challenges.
Interesting. And you mentioned earlier, one of the main challenges, and we've seen it with some of our customers before, is no one knows who you are. I mean,
Mm.
do you have any experience or maybe any advice on how you could get your name out there, especially when it comes to attracting
Mhm.
talent when you are a startup and no one knows who you are?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess like you need to work on a value proposition for the candidates you're trying to attract, which is end to end. So yes, we don't have our name out yet, but on the other hand, we don't treat you like a cog in a giant machine, and
Yeah.
you're gonna get treated like somebody who actually matters. We're gonna create a team around you, and we're gonna work closely with founders and customers. And I guess like it's a different appeal, right? Some people would just not go for it, but on the other hand, those people you probably don't want them to come in anyway. I guess like one of the things that can help is essentially getting yourself known through open source, through podcasts, participating in recruitment events, and just like getting your face around, really.
Yeah, for sure. No, that definitely works. I mean, the podcast for sure. I mean, as you can tell,
Yeah.
but I think in general, it is a really interesting question because I think startups, no one. I mean, it's for commercial reasons as well. No one knows who they are for technical
Mhm.
reasons. Like basically, it's an issue that they face across the board, not just obviously in terms of recruitment, but I suppose looking into it from a technical point of view as well. So a lot of the founders I've spoken to. Maybe come from more of a commercial background. And when they talk about hiring, it's more commercially. Are there perhaps any challenges you would say are unique to technical roles, obviously, given the fact that you're a director of engineering and throughout your experience in sort of CTO positions? Anything that's unique to tech, would you say that you found challenging when it comes as well to hiring?
Yeah, I mean, for startups in particular, sometimes you're in a stage where what's important is not building things properly yet, but it's about identifying product market fit. Now, for a lot of engineers, because of their previous past in companies where they didn't get much autonomy, they kind of gave up the idea of being involved in the product aspect of it much. And as a result, whatever you're doing might sound too simple in terms of like it's not going to get those flashy, modern, large scale technologies on your CV. And so some people might be put off because, hey, I'm not going to work in multi cloud across 3 cloud providers with Kubernetes. Well, because we don't need that either ever or definitely not yet. And so the point is, hiring folks that are primarily motivated by playing with the latest tools might be a problem.
Interesting. I see. And I suppose moving on from that as well, I mean, in terms of your experiences or past successes that you've had, obviously, again, at both larger and smaller organizations, not just in terms of hiring, but just in general, I mean, are there any exciting projects you've worked on before or anything that you would say, these are like some of my past, like really proud achievements that I've worked on before?
Yeah, I mean, I work on a ton of interesting things. I guess like of all sorts. Like one that was really interesting was I work in a company called R3, which you mentioned. It was
Yep.
all about cryptography, a distributed ledger called Corda. It was a technology where people compile against it, so it's released like a framework, like a Spring Boot of sorts, even if it does a completely different thing. And so you really get to learn, not only the cryptography aspects of it, which is really cool, but also like, hey, what does backward compatibility actually mean, and how do you achieve it? And you work on open source, which is a completely different way of working. Then I work on like I build a small order book for Index Labs, which is essentially like a matching engine for trading. Once again, so much to learn there and how it works and why it can work easily with a SQL database and what else can you do about it. And then most recently in JP Morgan, I work on a very large scale platform based project. We're essentially like allowing BaaS and SaaS workflows internationally, which once again is at a scale which would be very hard to find in companies that are smaller than a very large tier one bank. So
Sure.
yeah, totally.
And would you say so obviously the project you mentioned at JP Morgan being larger in scale, would you say that means that there is like a positive correlation between scale and difficulty? Would you say that means it is definitely more difficult or maybe not? I mean, what would you say is the difference between sort of
It
working on a
depends.
larger
I
scale
mean,
project?
this project in particular was definitely difficult from a technical point of view, but you also get a much higher budget. You typically get
Yeah.
more time. You can hire people that are more experienced at it. In other places, that was definitely not the case. And so, as an example, yes, we had to build a matching engine, but we had to build it in 20 days, and the company's fate was hanging on it. So it's a very different kind of challenge, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, I think budget's an interesting point actually, because obviously, how would you could you give a bit more insight into maybe how it works in terms of budget? So
Mm.
you're in your position, how do you allocate that budget when it comes to both not just the hiring but also paying for technology,
Mhm.
which software you pick? I mean, how do you usually approach budget allocation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The fun thing about it is that it changes quite a bit from company to company. Like as an example, in some companies, what you really get is a head count and some compensation bands for each role, which I'm not a big fan of, but that's how life works. In other companies, you get a pot for people and a different pot for technologies. And in some other companies, yet you basically get one large pot and you can do pretty much what you want, but then obviously you're responsible for it. So my guideline in general as a principle, obviously it applies differently based on what you're trying to achieve, but like my guiding principle has always been that I'd rather hire people that are quite experienced to start any function or team. And if I need to pay a bit more and hire fewer people, that's definitely something that I would do. Because I think like that in software, which is essentially a development activity, things are not linear. And so, as an example, if you hire two people for half the salary, a person that's very experienced, even if it costs double, will probably produce much more because you do less mistakes, there's some long-term thinking. Now, it does not mean that you don't hire people who are a little bit less experienced or junior people, but in general, I tend to be a little bit top heavy for structured projects from the get-go.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say. I don't even think that's just exclusive to technology either, because even for commercial positions, it's quite similar. It's the
Yeah.
difference between hiring a top performer, paying a little bit
Mhm.
higher than maybe what the budget initially said, to get more out of them. I mean, there was recently, well, it's actually been a while ago, but there was this article, this report by the REC, which found that
Okay.
a hiring mistake can cost 6 times the salary. So, yeah, base salary. And as you
More
can
money.
imagine, with certain technical, yeah, exactly, with technical roles. And that was a report that was from a few years ago, which I
Mhm.
think, given the market, might be even worse now. I mean, with how things have gone. I mean, what do you think in terms of, obviously, since 2022, 2023, with the slowdown in the market, what impact do you think that's had when it comes to hiring as a tech leader uh, in this current
So
environment?
it's kind of funny, right? Because to an extent, when you're now hiring, it has made some things easier because candidates have kind of lower expectations. I think like, you know, before COVID and before the mass layoffs and, the whole crunch, there was a very different position in terms of markets. Essentially, candidates had very strong upper end, which is not necessarily a negative thing, it's just what it is. And now it's a little bit different where kind of like employers have a different, power dynamic these days. And so if you want to go to the market, it's somewhat easier. On the other hand, the problem is that there's a lot of people that are looking, and that makes it a little bit harder to identify people that you actually want to spend time interviewing. Because basically every time you open a role, it's like 300 applicants, of which you probably don't want to talk to for, I don't know, maybe 290 of those, right? And so it becomes harder because there's a lot of noise.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, every time we've seen it when we post jobs on behalf of clients, we get
Yeah.
hundreds of applicants in a few days. I think I spoke to a tech leader who said he put up a machine learning engineer position and received like 2,000 applications in a few weeks. It was insane. So especially for the really high in demand roles, and yeah, getting above the noise is something that I recommend to candidates as well, whether it means like meeting people in person, asking for
Yeah, getting in
references.
touch.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess, is that an approach you take as well when it comes to building teams? Have you ever sort of looked at personal network references when it comes to hiring as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Obviously, personal networks is a no-brainer. As in, you work with people before, you know who they are, there's no surprises there. Obviously, what happens is as you work through the years, people that are particularly good, which is the ones you want to hire, tend to also be particularly successful, which makes them really hard to pull, right? Even
Sure.
if they're friends, sometimes they're kind of like, hey, I just joined this startup, which is super cool, and the founder is another friend of mine. You want to join yourself? I'm like, oh, wow, okay. So maybe not this year, maybe try next year, right? And so there is that. Obviously, personal network is great. I think it's essential if you're a tech leader to form some connections with people you trust. On the other hand, if you go network, the other thing you can do is basically ask people for the best people they know in specific roles from previous experience. And then if you trust them, you can somewhat trust people they recommend. Now, in lack of that, my typical approach is to really work in an active way on LinkedIn. So then to work with internal and external recruiters a lot, where I explain to them exactly what I'm looking for, why certain profile looks better than another, and then work closely with them to say, okay, yes, no, why, until they get it. And then the success rate of the interview is quite good, because once they're really there, you probably got about 50% chance that SEB coming in person to meet you in an interview will end up getting hired.
That's quite high. Right, that's the goal, really, to be honest. I mean, we've heard it from a lot of clients as well. They don't want to interview too many people. Ultimately, you want to interview very few good people. So getting it to 50% should be a goal, I think, across the board. That's a good idea,
a
actually.
Hard goal, but that's fine.
It definitely is.
Which doesn't mean lowering the standard of the interview process, by the way. It just means that you really aim at getting super good people at the top of the funnel, with that you don't waste time people that wouldn't get hired otherwise.
Sure. And along those lines as well, I mean, if we're talking about the team and the function as a whole, I mean, what do you think it takes to build a high-performing tech team and a high-performing tech function, would you say?
Long discussion. Well,
I'm sure. Yeah.
So I think there's a few ones, right? So first of all, I think what's important is you need to mix in different strengths. Now, a lot of people will say this because it's cheap to say it, but it's actually quite a hard thing to do in practice. Because when I say strengths, the people who are really strong at something, they tend to be not that strong at many other things. So as an example, if you find somebody who's really strong at, I don't know, distributed systems, they will probably spend 95% of their time studying distributed systems and getting better distributed systems. So the chances that if you ask them if they know React or, I don't know, your favorite unit testing library are pretty much zero, that they actually know them. And so the problem is, if you think that these folks are going to work on their own, on the day-to-day, you're not going to hire people who are really strong in one thing, because you cannot function on your own if you're really strong just at one thing or two, right? While if you accept that people are going to work together without splitting the task, perhaps using pair programming or ensemble programming and these techniques, then you can really go to the market and say, hey, for this specific team, I don't need a generic backend engineer or a generic full stack engineer in LS. But what I need is somebody who, I don't know, really understands how to use the type system to increase the confidence that you have, and modules and contracts. And I know that if I add them to that team, that skill is going to be there, and everything they do is going to just, rise in quality because of that, right? And so that's really how you start thinking about team. Is much more similar to how you would assemble a football team than a software team in many companies.
Yeah, interesting. So it's like a division of labor, really. It's everyone knows what their specific tasks are. But I suppose when it comes to smaller organizations and the challenges, maybe you can't hire as many people. Does that mean that then they do need to be more generalists? So would you have to then probably compromise on that a bit?
You can do this. By the way, it's not like a single person will cover a single skill. So as an example, I always find that the right amount of people for a team is in between 4 and 5, and probably no more. So typically you form these small equivalent cross-functional teams without tech leads or anything, where people have different strengths from each other, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need 20 people to reach a minimum, right? So as an example, you find somebody who's really great at the front-end part, UI design, like reactive programming and so on, and then you mix them up with somebody who's an expert at the type system and somebody who understands distributed systems and infrastructure, and you got a great team.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, 4 to 5 sounds. Where is there any reason why you say 4 to 5 would be the ideal?
So yeah, it's a good question. I think like 4 to 5 to me, because is the right amount of people where they abstract the unit of work allocation. So as an example, I can think, hey, those 4 or 5 people are working on one thing. Now, if there are 10 people, well, those 10 people are going to work on more than one thing. And if they're less, I'm going to need to know the specifics of who's doing what, because, for example, if one person goes on holiday, then that team's going to stop functioning if there's only 2 people or 3 people, right? And so I think, like, off the top of my head, 4, maybe 5, depending on the people, is a good number, because they're kind of like, they're self-contained enough that you can think they're going to do one thing at a time, and they're resilient enough that if a person or 2 are on holiday, you're not going to get 0 out of them.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's an interesting idea. I haven't thought of it in that way. But it makes sense. I mean, that's why we see as the organizations grow, they try and add more and more managers, and they then manage smaller teams, who then manage smaller teams, etc. I think in terms of your experience as well, I mean, outside of just building out the tech team, I mean, before you even get to the point where you start hiring, what sort of culture do you think is best for a high performing tech team?
Mhm. Yeah, I guess, like, so first of all, I mean, culture is like trying to shape a shadow, which is mostly like reflects you and what you do and which choices you make as a manager, right? And the company likewise. So at the end of the day, what's on the walls doesn't matter, is who you promote and fire and, scold based on what, that's gonna make a difference. And how you set the incentives as well, right? And I guess, like, in terms of culture, what's important is if you recognize that people can do great things and they typically want to, and they're trustworthy and honest, and the idea is this is just the average person, we're not talking about superheroes, then the way you hire and the way you treat people is different, right? Where you give trust by default and you treat people like adults. There's a joke, I don't remember where it comes from, which book I read it in, which is like, who's the only person who hates being treated like a 13 years old more than a 30 years old is an adult, right? And that's why,
Yeah.
and the point being is, if you treat people like kids, eventually they'll behave like kids. This is just how reality works. There's this principle of reciprocity, where if you treat somebody like they're dishonest and, at any possibility they could do wrong, the first time they'll have the possibility, they'll do it, right? Because they see it as an adversarial kind of situation. If you bring people in with the idea that, hey, these people are great, I spend a ton of time structuring hiring to get them in, they're very expensive, they know what they're great at, they know it much better than me, then the point is, I'm not going to tell exactly what to do, I expect them to tell me what to do, because it's kind of like why you hire people that are great at what they do, right? And so I'm not going to micromanage, not because, oh, I'm great as a manager, but because it wouldn't make sense, because by definition, I hire people that are better than me at what they do best.
Makes sense. Yeah, definitely. I think I can agree with that as well. And even when it comes to the interview process, I mean, you said earlier how it takes, about 50% success. I don't know if this is linked to what you just mentioned, but what separates that 50% who gets the job when you get to the interview stage? So on paper, they seem really good, surely, from the 50% who don't, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, right? So one is, on paper, everybody can write whatever.
Sure.
Simply said, right? So there's a percentage which is, for some reasons, whether they outright lie or whether they lie to themselves or whatever, right? So as an example, occasionally you meet people which have, I don't know, 15 years of experience in Java, tech leads here and there in Java. You ask them to code something in Java, ridiculously straightforward, not like some weird algorithms or something, and they just collapse. And it's just like, hey, what's going on? Now, sometimes they might collapse for emotional reasons, but at that point, what you do, right? You take the risk and spend 6 times the base salary to get them out. And so that's one aspect. To me, the biggest thing in terms of the interview is to basically screen out people which you don't want there from a cultural point of view. So as an example, if people have worked in companies where the culture was really odd and aggressive or controlling, and people think that you need to become a manager because this way you're better than other people and you tell them what to do, or if, I don't know, senior people think they should only be the ones reviewing the code from junior people and blocking their stuff until they get approval. So basically, any sign of this cultural weirdness is probably better not to. Now, some people can change, but I'm not a psychologist. I mean, I'm a software guy, so I'd rather not spend the time to, having to solve problems beforehand rather than not creating them in the first place. The other big one is people who want to work on their own. Now, there is a place for those people in the industry. It's not just the way I tend to run the teams I oversee. So I'm a big fan of social engineering. I want people that work together, figure things out together. They're literally working together most of the day. Now, if you're the kind of person where you would rather put headphones on and work by yourself, there's probably other teams you should be looking at in general.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, no, and I think it comes down to culture a lot of the time as well. And the difference between the ones who work solo and the ones who work in teams, I think probably changed now that we've gone out of COVID. I think people have started to embrace working together a bit more. Obviously, most positions are now hybrids that we're seeing from our customers. We don't tend to see many for them.
So yeah, I get what you mean, right? But for me, it's not even the remote or in-person thing. So as an example, ensemble programming, pair programming, they work well even remotely. So it's hardly a problem. Then like what's happening is even before COVID, there were people who simply, so they told me several times in several interviews, hey, I chose this job because I don't enjoy working with people. And I'm like, wow, well, what are we going to do for the next 55 minutes?
Yeah, no, I see. No, you're right. 100%. I think even the trend towards remote working was happening before COVID. I think COVID just expedited it, and it was predominantly in the tech industry as well. So yeah, that's not really the point. It is more about just working together, whether it's remotely, whether it's in person, solving problems together. Yeah, makes sense. So let's move on to more of a macro level, looking at wider industry trends. I mean, outside of just focusing on tech hiring, I mean, in general, is there any opportunities that you've seen in the tech industry that's maybe being overlooked, or what do you think 2024 has in store for us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the interesting things, a lot of people will talk about AI. I don't know. I don't want to say they won't work and then it will work, and people will write in books that, I said that in 2024 or something. But no, to me, I guess like the big one that's coming up is this tendency for some companies to look at the cloud providers and say, hey, enough, let's move out of here, primarily driven by the costs, which been ramping up in a somewhat uncontrolled way. I guess like one of the things that's happening is there was a rush to the cloud and to SaaS services for everything. So as an example, hey, why would you run your own logging? Yeah, let's just buy whatever, Datadog or whatever it is, and monitoring and observability, and there's all like solutions you can think of for everything, feature flags and whatnot. But then when you look at the bill for each of these providers and you add them up, it's like eye-watering, and people are like, hey, do I really want to spend 12K a month as a company on logging? Well, all I need to do is host some open source tech with some support that I pay maybe, and get the same results at a fraction of the price. Yeah, sure, it's going to cost some effort. I need to make it work in a certain way, but I'm also in control, right? And so I guess one of the things is there's going to be like a movement of moving away from cloud providers. We already like saw that with like 37 signals and things like that, where the idea is that like, hey, we moved out of the cloud. It wasn't that hard. We saved something like, I don't know, 12 millions a year. And that's a really good reason why you want to do it.
Yeah. And we have, I remember we've discussed this briefly before, and I've also seen from our side as well, the increased demand for platform engineers, and companies wanting to go cloud agnostic. I guess in terms of from your side, I mean, what sort of talent do you think therefore will become really high in demand when it comes to this transition and companies trying to move away from this?
Yeah, I guess there's going to be like predominantly two things, right? There's going to be companies which will double down on their cloud strategy and try to go across different cloud providers. So in a kind of like cloud agnostic way. So things like Kubernetes and infrastructure as code, Pulumi, Terraform, those things are evergreen at the moment. Like those people really important in a lot of companies. The other type is, as I was saying before, I think a lot of companies will start offering products that you just buy once and host yourself, and maybe pay a license a year, but not something that is traffic or usage based, right? And so the whole idea is probably the importance of people who understand networking and who understand how to host things and containerize things. That stuff's also gonna, come back to an extent. Where I'm like, okay, now if I want to host, I don't know, an open source or commercial version of Slack, where instead of paying per user or per messages, I pay, a fixed amount a year. Well, we still need to manage it, monitor it, make it accessible within or outside, or I don't know, inside a VPN, and how's it going to work? And so essentially, like, I think networking is going to be one, and then once again, containerizing things and all.
Sure. Awesome. No, definitely. And we've already, from our perspective, we've already seen the trend towards that. Especially, it was interesting you mentioned Kubernetes, Terraform, etc. Very, very high in demand from what we've seen as well. So yeah, it definitely seems to already be happening. But no, I'm glad it didn't get into a huge discussion about AI and what everyone else talks about. So that was good. But listen, thanks. I really enjoyed the chat today, Michele. Thank you for your time. We should definitely do this again sometime. But we covered some really interesting points just as an overview about tech hiring, what it takes to build a high performing team, and even a little bit there in terms of what's going to happen to the industry. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
All right, thanks all for having me here, Abraham. It was a pleasure. I look forward, for the next time.
Yeah, awesome. And thanks. And if you the audience enjoyed listening to this, please go ahead and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, FinTech Weekly. Follow our company page, Kickstart. We'll be posting the full version of this onto both our YouTube channel and our website. And we hope to see you soon. And thank you again, Michele. And let's until the next one. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.